Hey, RetconRaider here. Today's video is dedicated to Mildly Nuclear, one of my earliest patrons and a regular fixture on the official Phoenix Point Discord channel. Thanks for your support, Nuke. That said, let's get started. Now, as you may already know, the briefing number 4 was officially released on April 17th. This 71-page ebook further expands the lore of the Phoenix Point setting with 5 new stories by Alan Stroud and Jonas Kairatsis. It also includes a short introduction, a 4-page poem, and 1 reprinted story, The Old Man of the Sea. Much like the last 2 entries in the briefing series, briefing number 4 is loosely themed around a specific subject. In this case, the intent behind the new ebook is to not only provide new information about the Disciples of Anu and the Pandoravirus, but also to help communicate what sets the two apart from each other. With 48 pages of new material, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we won't be talking about everything today. Instead, this video will focus on 3 of the stories in the collection: the Depths of Civilization number 2, the Last Patriarch, and the Big Egg. We'll get to the rest of the stories next time. Let's start with what may be the most complex of the new stories, The Depths of Civilization number 2 by Alan Stroud. Much like The Depths of Civilization number 1, this story is presented as a summary of various essays written by Randolph Symes, an early member of the Phoenix Project and its predecessor groups. The story begins by discussing some of Randolph's studies into prehistory, with a particular focus on archaeological discoveries related to proto-human species. He briefly discusses 2 cases in particular, the Piltdown Man hoax of 1908 and the discovery of the Tong Child in 1924. These 2 events are used to set up frames of reference for the main body of the story, which focuses on the Lei Meng expedition of 1915. This 8-man expedition was led by Lei Meng, a tenured Chinese archaeologist from Beijing. He intended to investigate rumors of ancient graveyards hidden in the caverns around the Qinling Mountains, a region that contained numerous sinkholes. In particular, he wanted to investigate the largest crater, one that the local villagers referred to as Amo Dong, the Demon Hole. According to local legends, it earned this name sometime between 1290 and 1263 BC, during the Shang dynasty, when monsters began emerging from the crater and attacking nearby villages. When village leaders pleaded with Emperor Pangang to send help, he ordered his eldest daughter, Lu Wei, to lead an army into the region to investigate, and none of them returned. Soon afterwards, deserters who had survived the massacre began spreading tales of the fearsome demons that lived deep beneath the earth. Lei Meng assembled a team of 4 technical experts to accompany him on his archaeological expedition. This included 2 Chinese academics named Huan Yi and Zhen Ping, as well as 2 foreigners, Dr. Andrew Salamar, who helped with the record-keeping, and James Dawson of the Piltdown Man Committee. Lei Meng then hired 3 local guides, including a man named Qian Yu, to lead them to the legendary Demon Hole. It took them 9 days to reach their destination, during which time they encountered several problems. 5 days into their journey, Lei Meng discovered that his pocket watch had stopped working for no apparent reason, leading to concerns that some of their other equipment might have also been compromised. Then, 2 days later, Zhen Ping abruptly packed his things and left without explanation. It was also slowly becoming evident that James Dawson had only agreed to accompany the expedition in order to subvert or otherwise sabotage their findings. Despite these complications, the group arrived at the Demon Hole on August 23rd, and over the next few days they began exploring the area in and around the crater. One of their first discoveries was a group of dead monks near one edge of the sinkhole. There was no obvious cause of death, leading Lei Meng to speculate that they had simply given up and willingly allowed themselves to die. Undeterred by this discovery, they continued to explore the caverns, discovering several strange new species of flora and fauna, and Lei Meng wrote that he was beginning to experience something he described as an otherworldly intoxication. The next day, they discovered what they called the Qinling Woman, what appeared to be a well-preserved female proto-human, and that night, an incident took place. Although we don't know the specifics of what occurred, it apparently resulted in the deaths of 2 members of their expedition, Dr. Salamar and one of their guides, Qian Yu. The next morning, James Dawson fled with most of the samples that the expedition had gathered, but Lei Ming managed to retain possession of the kindling woman by sleeping atop the box they had stored her in. The final journal entry states that Lei Ming and Huan Yi intended to pursue Dawson, but that Lei Ming was also suffering from a maddening itch on his neck. One last fragment of Lei Ming's journal only consisted of a single sentence: "Some rise by sin and some by virtue fall." This appears to be a quote taken from the play Measure for Measure by William Shakespeare. Lei Ming's journal ends there, but based on Randolph Syme's findings, Lei Ming and Huan Yi never caught up with Dawson. They instead returned to one of the local villages, arranged to have the kindling woman delivered to a research center in Taiwan, and were never seen again. The kindling woman was studied at the research center for 6 weeks, at which point the facility was broken into and all traces of both the kindling woman and the Lei Ming expedition were stolen or destroyed. Fortunately, a member of the Second Phoenix Society had visited the research center shortly before the break-in, acquiring a copy of early research notes and a physical sample of the preserved body, one of the kindling woman's fingers. These were taken to the Phoenix Society's laboratory in Bilbao in 1916, where they were studied by Dr. Luis Garcia. They were later transferred to the Connecticut Sanctuary, a storage facility maintained by the Phoenix Working Group, where the finger was labeled with the code word Amatsu. Although historically significant, there were very few public records of the Lei Ming expedition or the kindling woman, which Randolph Symes ultimately blamed on the political turmoil caused by World War I. There's a lot to take away from this story, but perhaps one of the most intriguing parts is the physical description of the kindling woman. According to Dr. Garcia and the Chinese researchers, she was physiologically female but otherwise largely inhuman in nature. Her body featured a unique double-interlaced bone structure and a cranial capacity equal to or even larger than that of a human. Despite already being roughly the size of an adult human woman, there were also signs that the kindling woman was not yet fully grown at the time of her death. While this story does give us a great deal of fascinating new information, it also gives us a large number of new, unanswered questions. For example, what happened to Lei Ming after the expedition? The answer to this question seems somewhat obvious, given that the archaeologist was showing signs of Pandoravirus infection. The reason he never returned to his tenured position in Beijing is likely because he either died or mutated. In comparison, the fates of his associates, Xinping and Huan Yi, are far more mysterious. Xinping abruptly abandoned the expedition after its first week, and Huan Yi was never seen again afterwards. What's more, Randolph Symes was surprised to find that Huan Yi didn't appear in any surviving academic records, heavily implying that all traces of his existence had been deliberately erased. Is it possible that one or even both of the Chinese academics had actually been spies? Huan Yi's complete and utter disappearance is somewhat reminiscent of the way that all traces of the kindling woman, aside from the samples acquired by the Phoenix Society, were also effectively erased. Was this simply a coincidence, or was Huan Yi somehow involved with the attempt to cover up the kindling woman's existence? And if he was involved, was it as a co-conspirator, or was he simply collateral damage? Then, of course, there's the big question. What exactly was the kindling woman? Given the circumstances surrounding her discovery, the most likely explanation is that she was simply a mutant, made inhuman by the effects of the virus. Then again, it's also possible that she was a pre-adolescent member of the precursor race described in The Tomb of the Phoenix. Unfortunately, these are all questions that we just don't have answers to. Not yet, anyway. So, for now, let's just move on. Next we have The Last Patriarch by Jonas Kairatses, which is another truly fascinating story. It gives us our first real glimpse at the origins of the disciples of Anu, by exploring the final years of a closely related cult known as the Holy Disciples of the Xenoglossic Doctrine. The Holy Disciples were described as being one of the many groups that splintered off from the Blavatskian Theosophy movement during the early 1900s. The founding council had formed the group after receiving direct inspiration from a supreme spiritual master, who spoke in an unknown tongue that could only be understood in a trance state. The Holy Disciples claimed that they could replicate this trance state with proper preparation and expensive ingredients. The story is told by an unnamed narrator who, while seeking fulfillment, stumbles upon a website about the Xenoglossic doctrine. Intrigued by what he found, the narrator then traveled to Sofia, Bulgaria, where the Holy Disciples were supposedly based. There, he discovered that over the past century, the group's membership had dwindled to the point where only one person remained, an elderly man known as the Patriarch. Despite the Patriarch's eccentricities, the narrator was determined to learn more about the xenoglossic doctrine, and in effect, became the Patriarch's personal assistant. Together, they began rebuilding the group, recruiting new members as the world steadily slipped further and further into crisis. As things grew worse around the globe, the Patriarch began having visions on an increasingly frequent basis. He spoke of a great impending change that would wash over the world, a metaphorical flood of transformation that would forever change humanity. As the Holy Disciples gained prominence in the years leading up to the Second Mist, two other rival cults also rose to oppose them: the Children of the Black Tide and the Order of Anu. We'll spend some more time talking about them in just a moment, but for now, suffice to say that the three cults shared certain beliefs and received similar visions. However, their individual interpretations of those visions differed, and their pride prevented them from working together. This all changed when the leaders of the three cults, including the Patriarch, were summoned together by the Exalted. The Patriarch met with the leaders of the Children and the Order near a ruined monastery on the shore of the Black Sea, at what was later known as the Gathering of the Three Elders. There, they argued among themselves, each too prideful to accept that there might be some truth to the beliefs of their rivals, but they all fell silent when the Exalted finally arrived. She explained that a time of change was coming, and that humanity was too weak and divided to survive it. All that was beautiful in the world would be destroyed unless she could find a way to turn back the black tide. Each of the elders carried a small fragment of understanding, but they were too prideful to work together. Her solution to this problem was to unify their strength and erase their weaknesses by literally combining them into a single Gestalt entity. Using a thick, transparent liquid, she somehow molded their flesh by hand, dissolving and reshaping their bodies to create the creature known as the Synod of Yearning. By combining the three cult leaders, she had also effectively combined the three cults. The Children of the Black Tide, the Holy Disciples of the Xenoglossic Doctrine, and the Order of Anu ceased to exist, instead replaced by a new group simply known as the Disciples of Anu. Strengthened by this fusion, the Disciples of Anu steadily rose back to prominence, becoming one of the three largest factions remaining following the events of the Second Mist. Once again, there's a lot to take away from this story. It explores the founding of the Disciples of Anu, gives us a glimpse of the three groups that preceded it, and also gives us our first real look at the Exalted. One of the most intriguing elements of this story are the three groups that were combined to form the Disciples of Anu. While the story primarily focuses on the Holy Disciples, it does give us a small amount of information about the other two cults as well, so let's take a moment to review what we know. The Children of the Black Tide were described as a sea cult with Polynesian origins, but beyond that, we're not told much else about them. Based on limited snippets of dialogue, it appears that their cult is nihilistic in nature, believing that everything in the universe is cyclical just like the tides, and that humanity can never hope to change it. The Order of Anu is instead described as a cult that claimed to have ancient knowledge that predated the history of Homo sapiens. Given what we know from stories such as the Disciples of Anu faction briefing and the Depths of Civilization No. 1, this seems to indicate that the cult is somehow linked to the precursor race that was described in the Tomb of the Phoenix. Their apparent knowledge of the fate of that ancient species, the meteor impact, the tidal waves, and the subsequent spread of the Pandoravirus heavily skewed their interpretation of the visions they received. They believed that mankind was inherently corrupt, and that the impending flood was a literal flood being sent as divine punishment from Anu, similar to the Great Flood described in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Much like the Children of the Black Tide, the Order of Anu did not believe there was anything humanity could do to avoid this divine punishment. In sharp contrast to the Children of the Black Tide's nihilism and the Order of Anu's doomsaying, the Patriarch of the Holy Disciples of the Xenoglossic Doctrine was instead described as believing that salvation was always possible. Perhaps this is why he was chosen by the Exalted, in hopes that his faith in humanity might offset the more self-destructive views of the other two cult leaders. It's also interesting to note that since this story is set between the First and Second Mist, likely sometime in the 2030s, stories like Fragments of Knowing likely portray the Order of Anu, not the Disciples of Anu. This is a very important distinction, because the original Order of Anu appears to have been far more uncompromising and self-destructive in nature. For example, the disciples of Anu use the virus to reshape their bodies, but they also actively resist being controlled by it. This is in sharp contrast to the cult portrayed in Fragments, who instead appear quite content knowing that their mutations will eventually force them to return to the ocean. In fact, members of this cult seem to actively look forward to the day that they could surrender themselves to the will of Anu, so they could be reborn as one of his servants and spend the rest of their lives in his kingdom. Of course, this brings us to a rather significant question. Just what is the Exalted? The Patriarch referred to her as a prophet of the Supreme Spiritual Master, while the Order instead referred to her as a messenger of Anu. The Gospel of the Exalted seems to describe her as a servant or assistant to the dead god, but it is interesting to note that the Order of Anu didn't actually seem to refer to Anu as the dead god until after their encounter with the Exalted. According to the Disciples of Anu faction briefing, the Exalted commands absolute authority over the faction, being the only one placed above the Synod of Yearning in the Church's hierarchy. She seems to have deliberately placed herself as a buffer between the disciples and Anu, acting as Anu's messenger while simultaneously appearing to work at cross purposes with the dead god. She claims that where the dead god would simply destroy humanity as divine punishment, she instead seeks to save it through transformation. The Exalted even stated, in her own words, that she had long tried to find a way to be human. Could it be that she herself was a member of the precursor race that first encountered the Pandoravirus millions of years ago? This potentially opens the door to some very interesting, if far-fetched, possibilities. If we assume that the Exalted is a survivor of that ancient civilization, what role did she play in the final days of the war against the Pandoravirus? If she was one of the scientists who developed the xenotoxin that was used to cripple the virus, then perhaps she later developed a way to control it as well. Or perhaps she was a member of the cult that chose to turn against their own kind, only to lament when the xenotoxin was used to kill the alien god that they worshipped. In the Depths of Civilization number 1, Randolph Symes even went so far as to propose that certain heroic figures from mythology, such as Gilgamesh, were actually survivors of a precursor race. He further speculated that these survivors might have been intent on further perpetuating their genetic legacy in any way possible. With all of this in mind, it could very well be possible that the Exalted is simply a living example of exactly what Randolph Symes proposed in his essays. Maybe the Exalted is just a survivor of the precursor race, infected with an alien virus, who's trying to find any way possible to perpetuate her genetic legacy, in this case by establishing a cult and literally shaping it in her own image. Of course, this is all pure speculation on my part, so take it with a grain of salt. Given that this sort of revelation would be a massive spoiler for the final game, it's also unlikely to be something that Alan Stroud or Jonas Kairatses would ever be willing to confirm. Let's move on to our third and final story for this video, The Big Egg by Alan Stroud. Now this is a story that I think a lot of us have been looking forward to. It was originally mentioned over a year ago in the faction briefing about New Jericho, and a few additional details were given in the introduction of the briefing number 1. According to those sources, the Big Egg incident took place in 2027 and involved a mutant attack on the Halpine McAllister oil rig Echo Gamma 18. Although Vanadium Inc. had provided 2 security guards for the oil rig, the attack was overwhelming, and in the end, only 3 people survived. The survivors were successfully evacuated by rescue helicopter, and one of them subsequently uploaded recordings of the incident onto YouTube. This marked the very first time that the true threat of the Pandoravirus was revealed to the general public. The Big Egg provides several additional details about the incident, but it's made even more compelling by the fact that it's told from the perspective of one of the mutant attackers. The narrator of the story is a crabman who still has vague memories of her former life before the virus compelled her to walk into the ocean. The story itself is fairly straightforward, describing how the narrator and numerous other mutants fought their way onto the oil rig on a mission of rescue and vengeance. They scaled the sides of the oil rig under cover of darkness, but were quickly spotted. The guards attempted to drive them back with automatic weapons, but the mutants quickly overwhelmed them. Throughout the battle, the narrator recalls a few potent memories of her former life, her husband and children, the death of her mother, and, most notably, the time she used to spend at a shooting range. After killing one of the guards, she uses these memories to her advantage, picking up the dead guard's rifle and wielding it for the rest of the story. The mutants force their way deeper into the facility, until finding and breaching a heavily secured room. They quickly slaughtered everyone inside, then located a captive mutant, the chosen child that they had been sent to recover. With their task complete, the mutants began withdrawing from the oil rig, though the narrator stopped long enough to fire warning shots at a rescue helicopter that was hovering nearby. As the mutants returned to the ocean, a massive claw rose up from the water to tear a chunk from the oil rig as one last act of vengeance. The narrator joined her brethren as they all began swimming back towards the secret place where they lived, but she stopped short upon hearing an unfamiliar voice, a woman who was bidding her to turn away from her current course and to instead follow a new one. The story then concludes with the narrator trying to decide what course to take. Now, we've previously gotten glimpses of characters who are in the process of mutating, such as the Viking in The Old Man of the Sea, or the narrator of Dotata. This, however, is the first time we've seen a story written from the perspective of someone who has already been completely transformed by the Pandoravirus. It provides us with valuable new insight into just how they operate. Based on the details given in the story, it does appear that even the lowly crabmen retain at least partial memories of their former lives, but they consider the lives that they once led on land to have been misguided. The mutants appear to share a mental link that is strongest in water, but which weakens considerably in the open air, likely representing how the Pandoravirus can facilitate communication between infected subjects. While they do appear to have some semblance of independence, they instinctually obey what they call the Song of the Depths, even when this might endanger their lives. That voice is what commanded the mutants to recover the chosen child from the oil rig, and to wreak bloody vengeance upon the people who had taken it. Upon completing this task, the mutants were rewarded with a sensation of rapture, which seems to imply that the Pandoravirus uses positive reinforcement to encourage continued loyalty. Although it's a very brief part of the story, the last few paragraphs seem to touch upon both the dead god and the exalted. The narrator describes her home as the secret place where we live and feed upon his corpse, which very likely refers to the dead god. Likewise, the woman who bade the narrator to turn away from the Song of the Depths was very likely the exalted. This doesn't really give us much to work with, but it does open up some new possibilities. If the dead god is the corpse that the mutants feed upon, then perhaps the Song of the Depths, the driving force behind the Pandoravirus, is in fact something else entirely. Maybe the Pandoravirus is some sort of intelligent bioweapon that was once under the control of Anu, before he was crippled or killed, possibly by the xenotoxin that was created by the precursor race. If so, then this might explain why the Exalted, a supposed agent of the dead god, now appears to be actively working against the Pandoravirus. Again, I could be entirely wrong here. After all, we're working with deliberately vague information, and the developers certainly aren't going to spoil the game by explaining the true nature of the dead god, the Exalted, and the Pandoravirus in advance. We'll just have to wait for the game's official release before we're likely to get answers to those sorts of questions. But hey, at least it gives us something to talk about in the meantime. This is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the Facebook page, the YouTube page, the subreddit, the official Discord channel, or the original crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. Links are in the description.